Hello and welcome. My name is Jackie Court. I'm Associate Director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance, a joint initiative between Stanford Law School and the Graduate School of Business. We're here today on our Rock Center Short to discuss the new SEC guidance impacting shareholder engagement and what directors need to know. We're recording this video in early April 2025, just 2 months after President Trump's inauguration. The pace of change across so many areas, tariffs, DOGE, geopolitics, just to name a few, have been swift and substantial. Interactions between companies and their investors are also changing rapidly, and this is all before we even have a new SEC chair confirmed. Today, we'll focus on the SEC's recent update to guidance on how an investor's engagement on ESG matters could impact its ability to file a Schedule 13G versus a Schedule 13D. For something that sounds pretty technical, this change has generated an enormous amount of attention. And we'll hear today on how this may be impacting how public companies and their boards interact with large shareholders on good days and even during proxy fights. Joining me for today's discussion are Sean Mathew and Christina Thomas from the law firm Kirkland & Ellis. Sean is a corporate partner and heads up Kirkland's shareholder activism and hostile takeover defense practice. In his practice, he focuses exclusively on advising public companies and their boards on activism defense, preparedness, and complex corporate governance and crisis situations. Christina is a capital markets partner and focuses her practice on advising public companies on SEC reporting, corporate governance matters. Prior to joining private practice, Christina spent 7 years at the SEC. During that time, among other things, she played a leading role advising on the most recent amendments to the proxy solicitation rules and the shareholder proposal rule. Thank you both for joining me today.
It's our pleasure. Thank you, Jackie, and to Stanford for inviting us. Christina and I have been hearing about this topic, I don't know, every day for the last 6 weeks from investors, from our clients. And so we have got a lot of interesting inside baseball that we're excited to share with you and the public company directors in the audience. So thanks for having us.
Yeah, and Jackie, as you noted, this can get pretty technical, but we are going to try and keep this conversation very practical. We want our audience to understand what's changed and what the takeaways are without getting into too much of the details about the legal implications of the rules.
But you'll keep us honest,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah, I'll try. Thank you so much. We can jump right in then. Before we touch on the new SEC guidance, Sean, how did we get here? What's changed in shareholder engagement, and what problems do we think the SEC is trying to solve here?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jackie. I mean, I think the context here is actually really important for the directors to understand. So look, I still remember the time when shareholder engagement was like just post earnings, right? There was no off-season engagement. There was no concept of even talking to the index funds. They would never be interested in that. And the idea that an independent director would speak to investors was, totally unheard of, right? So obviously those days are long gone. We're in a world where there's proxy season engagement, off-season engagement. Independent directors are a big part of this. Index funds are, active participants in engagement. But why is that? And like, what changed? And I think there are 3 factors that are sort of relevant to this discussion, right? So one, there's just been a growing concentration at the top of the shareholder register, right? And by that, really, I'm focusing on the big 3 index funds, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. At any given S&P 500 company today, they're at about 20% of the shareholder base. So that's one important change. 2, those index funds and other big investors have just been much more willing to vote their shares against directors on clear days in regular annual meetings to advance their policy preferences. And 3, the preferences that they're pushing are not just financial in nature. They've been sort of ESG focused among others. And so when I'm talking about voting against directors, I'm not talking about proxy contests here. I'm talking about just sort of a regular way annual meeting, uncontested, unopposed contest where for all of you in the audience, if you're a public company director, you sort of expect to be reelected with 97% support every year, right? And it is the threat then of potentially having a big shareholder or 2 vote against you, that is, part of the dynamic we're talking about here. So no surprise, that dynamic has resulted in companies and their directors wanting to engage more with these investors, wanting to understand what their preferences are, and cater to them so that they get their votes. And that applies for purposes of regular meetings, but also applies to proxy contests. And by the way, the index funds are sort of special in this regard because they're both large blocks of stock and also the most reliable allies historically to companies in proxy contests. And so they tend to be the swing votes in those contests. So without their support, it's very difficult for companies to succeed. So all of that coming together has made it so important over the last several years for companies to engage with their large investors. And then I think the other key dynamic is, and I would peg this around 8 years ago, right, Christina, like we started to see index funds and other large investors just become a lot more vocal on ESG, right? And that's been in the form of letters to shareholders or letters to CEOs, famously, but also very detailed voting policies that are published by all the large investors that lay out their ESG priorities and the consequences for not meeting them, right? And that's the most important of which is, in some cases, voting against directors if those policies are not met. And so back to your question, Jackie, like what is the problem the SEC is trying to solve here or maybe trying to solve here? I think the problem is there is at least a perception that companies and boards are changing their policies on ESG matters simply to cater to the preferences of these investors that are non-financial in nature, so they avoid getting these embarrassing negative votes. And look, I'm not saying that that is the only reason companies and boards engage with shareholders by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a factor, and I think that may be what is driving the SEC here.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, I think it's not just about the companies and the investors. It's also about these investors that may not be actively managing these shares and may not be using their own capital to buy the shares, right? They're managing on behalf of retail investors, right? And so there could be this disconnect between the ultimate owners of the shares who are looking for a pure financial return versus the investor holding those shares and voting those shares that's advocating for ESG policies that may not be tied to financial returns.
Christina, can you tell us then what's changed with the new SEC guidance?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think to sum it up, in essence, the guidance makes it more difficult for investors to pressure companies to adopt ESG policies. But let me get into a little bit precisely what's changed. So the rules themselves have not changed, right? We're just talking about an SEC staff level interpretation of the existing rules. So the rules state that any investor that holds more than 5% of a public company's voting securities must report that information publicly. These rules have been in place for decades now. They serve to alert both the company and the market when an investor may be building up a large ownership stake in a company that's moving towards a control position. So the investor that owns more than 5% has to report on one of two forms, either a Schedule 13D or a Schedule 13G. On February 11th of this year, the SEC staff published guidance that explains when investors may be required to report on Schedule 13D rather than 13G. And I know we're starting to get a little bit technical, but this is a very meaningful distinction for investors who hold large blocks of securities in public companies. So 13G is the short form that's intended to be used by passive investors. 13D is required by investors that have an intent to influence control at a particular company. And so 13D requires much more disclosure and much more frequent updating. Now, the SEC's new guidance, it updated the staff's interpretation of when a passive investor would have to switch from reporting on a Schedule 13G to a Schedule 13D. And so it gave some new examples of actions that could necessitate that flip. So specifically, the guidance says that Schedule 13G may be unavailable to investors who pressure an issuer to adopt ESG policies by explicitly or implicitly conditioning their support for director nominees on the company's adoption of the investor's policy. So prior to February 11th, the earlier guidance, I think, gave a lot of market participants a little more certainty that ESG topics were safe to discuss with companies and wouldn't necessitate a switch to 13D. But, I think for our first little bit of inside baseball here, I think, you're not going to see this written down in the new guidance, but we did hear from the SEC staff that, they indicated to market participants that an investor just pointing to its proxy voting policy that's already published, that's not going to trigger a switch from 13G to 13D. The intent of the new guidance, according to the staff, is that they want to address the practice of 13G filers demanding sort of a quid pro quo on ESG matters in exchange for director votes. So that's really kind of what the new guidance is trying to capture.
Right. And it just like from what we're hearing from other, from investors in the community, who heard that sort of bit of inside baseball from the SEC staff. Look, it sounds clear, right? No quid pro quos, but I think they're not really taking a ton of comfort from it because the guidance still uses the word implicit, right? So, and the reality is the proof is in the pudding in enforcement, right? Ultimately, enforcement is all done and thought about in hindsight. So this only matters and it's only going to be looked at if an investor votes against a director, right? That's the only fact pattern that's relevant. And so someone votes against a director, there could be someone looking into like, was there an implicit threat on the basis of ESG or not, right? And so that's where it gets tricky. And I think that's what sort of all the lawyers for the investors and sort of the policymakers internally are sort of struggling with how to navigate this going forward.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So just jump in here. Could investors just switch from their filing, just switch to filing a 13D? What's the problem with that?
You're absolutely right, Jackie. They could just switch. It can definitely be done. We've also see there's plenty of investors who aren't necessarily looking to take over the company that file on 13D. So it does happen, but I just think that investors are going to do their best to avoid it. Those that want to remain passive investors and hold blocks of many companies in the market. So I think the reality here is that switching from 13G to 13D for certain investors, it's just impractical for them. So in particular, the index funds that Sean talked about, the ones that must hold shares in thousands of companies across relevant indices. Preparing a Schedule 13D, as I noted, it's much more disclosure. It's much more frequent reporting, and so it just wouldn't really align with what their investments are, and the fact that they believe themselves to be passive investors and aren't looking to influence control at the company.
Sounds like a problem for AI to solve, right? I mean, it seems like there could be a technological solution, but I'm saying that facetiously, but maybe in the future there is like a technological solution that makes that easier if that is a way to address this. But I would say even if there were a solution like that, you alluded to this earlier, Christina, there is a signaling element of being a 13D filer that makes it quite different in nature than being a G filer. So it's possible, but I think a lot of investors would probably think twice about being associated with that type of filing.
Yeah. The market pays attention when an investor flips from 13G to 13D and wants to know sort of what's the story there.
Exactly.
So if an investor wants to stay 13G, they have a discomfort with the new implicit language. How are investors reacting? What are they doing?
Yeah, so investors really had to react fast once this guidance was published, because we really, we were already kind of really in the thick of proxy season, and investors were starting to hold meetings with their portfolio companies to discuss the matters that are going to be up for a vote at the annual shareholders meeting. So, overall, I'll say what we're seeing and what we're hearing is that investor reactions have been a bit all over the place. I think each investor is really trying to balance its own view of what the legal risk is here against its desire to engage with companies and advance policy preferences. So shortly right after the guidance came out, it was widely reported that both BlackRock and Vanguard paused meetings with their portfolio companies just entirely. Both have now resumed holding meetings, but we've heard that BlackRock reportedly now begins each meeting by reciting a disclaimer that emphasizes its role as a passive investor. We've also seen several large investors at this point replace existing proxy voting guidelines and policies that are or were directed at voting outcomes to instead express more general policies that emphasize the investor's view of best corporate governance practices. So we expect that will probably continue to be a popular approach.
Yeah, and I think, for the directors out there, this applies, like our understanding is that this applies across the board. It's not just if one of these large investors happens to be a 13G filer at your company because they own more than 5%. If they own less than 5% at another one of your companies, they're likely to be applying all of these new policies, including, the passive investor disclaimer, et cetera. No matter what, it's just going to be easier from a compliance perspective for them to do that. So I would just expect that across the board.
So after the dust settles here, what do you think this will mean for independent director engagement going forward?
I think we're going to see changes. I think company shareholder engagement is just going to look different going forward. So as we've already seen and just mentioned, we're seeing changes to voting policies, right? Moves towards expressing more preferences rather than sort of like strict policies that if not followed would result in a negative vote. So I think it's worth noting that the policies can change, but that doesn't mean that investors can't vote against directors. So what could end up happening here is that it'll be more difficult for companies to predict how a particular investor will vote, and there might be just less of that certainty and ability to have those conversations in advance in order to prevent a negative vote. So I think we might also see funds scaling back on off-season engagement and being less willing to share complaints with companies and be direct with companies. So if that were to happen, engagements could just become less valuable to issuers if the funds are less forthcoming and less willing to speak freely. So I think as a result, companies will have to really focus more attention on their investors' proxy voting policies that apply to all companies, rather than assuming they're going to receive individualized feedback.
Thanks. And Sean, your practice focuses on shareholder activism. So how do you see this impacting shareholder activism and proxy contests?
Yeah, look, I think it's a little early to tell, right? So we're still only sort of 2 months in, and as Christina said earlier, sort of this happened right in the midst of proxy season. But I'll give you a few observations. I think you have to think about it in 2 ways. So there's sort of direct impacts to activism and sort of indirect impacts to how it'll impact activism. So look, directly, the bottom line is, Christina's phrase quid pro quo, like you can't trade governance for a vote anymore, right? So that being said, as it relates to the real life of proxy fights, I actually don't think that's going to make that big of a difference to how proxy fights are engaged in by companies, by activist hedge funds, or by the investors. As Christina said, the style, the format of the engagements may look a little different, but the end of the day, the way these things work, all the large investors, who already meet with the company and the activist are going to continue to meet with the company and the activist. They're going to hear both sides of the story on strategy and on which directors they want to elect. And that type of free-flowing conversation really should not be impacted by this new guidance. Again, the investors may decide to be a little bit more conservative just in light of the broader concerns around this guidance, but I don't actually think it should impact this that much. What it will change, again, is the specific scenario where, look, an index fund says in the context of engaging with a company in a proxy fight, well, I'd love to give you my vote, but it'd be great if you also declassify your board at the same time. And look, there are examples of that happening historically, but there are not that many examples of that. And that's just a lever that quite clearly is no longer on the table under this new guidance if that investor wants to stay a 13G filer. But look, even if you believe that happens a lot, again, I don't think it's going to change the outcomes of these proxy fights in a material way. By the way, the other type of shareholder activism you sometimes think about is shareholder proposals. I just want to say, because there's, I think, a little bit of confusion out there in the market. This should not impact engagement with an investor on shareholder proposals. That has nothing to do with a director vote. It's just about a proposal. So I think you should, again, be able to engage freely with investors on that topic. But indirectly, I think I would say it may have an impact, and it may not be a positive impact for companies. And Christina alluded to this earlier, right? If the quality of the engagement between the company and its largest investors is less good because the investor is just more reluctant to express its views because it's worried about enforcement of this provision, the company just has less information. It has a worse relationship potentially with its investors. And, it's just not clear which way that cuts, right? So one way it could cut, pro company would be, well, the investors are all afraid about enforcement, so they're just never going to vote against directors. Well, that would be great. But on the other hand, you could imagine a scenario where they just know the company less well, and they know the company's directors less well. And when it comes to a proxy fight, they might actually be much more willing to take the activist side of the story because they just don't know the players at the company as well as they do today. So I think that would be an unfortunate result. At the end of the day, this is still, as I said, pretty early days, and we're looking forward to seeing how it plays out.
So given those risks, what advice do you have for public company directors?
Yeah, a few things. And I think this applies sort of across the board, activism or just clear day engagement. Number one, if you want to engage, you as the public company director sitting out there should ask for the meeting, right? Like you cannot rely anymore on these investors reaching out to you. They might. We've already heard a number of investors saying they will not reach out to companies anymore. Number two, sort of in the same vein, once you have that meeting on the calendar, you're going to have to set the agenda and be very proactive about it. I think it's not that investors will necessarily be 100% in listen only mode, but I think you should take the onus on developing the agenda, driving the conversation, which means, you're going to have to guess a little bit like what the investors' priorities are in a way that maybe you haven't had to in the past. But just to give an example, right? Like, and I've heard this from investors, including index investors, they don't just care about ESG. I think there's a misperception, particularly of the index funds, that that's all they care about. And so in this world where they're not driving the agenda for you, I think it's important for companies not to fall into this trap of, hey, we just did some really important material M&A deal, but we have an hour with BlackRock. Let's spend 45 minutes talking about a climate initiative that is not really material to our company. That's the kind of thing that's not likely a good use of your time. I think it's just important to prioritize for you and your company what the most material issues are if you want to get the most out of these meetings going forward. And look, at the end of the day, like, as I said earlier, we're 2 months into this, not even. So expect this to evolve. Investor preferences are going to evolve. Their policies are going to evolve. But in the meantime, I think it is important for boards to press their management teams and IR teams in particular on creative ways to get honest feedback from investors, right? And there could be lots of ways to do that. It's, reaching out for more meetings, could be third-party investor perception surveys. We've seen that used to good effect in the past. But at the end of the day, the last thing you want as a board is to be surprised.
That's great advice. So we're going to close out soon, but the quick hits, Christina and Sean, what else should directors keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I'll start on this one. So, I think it's definitely worth noting that the 13 DG guidance was a big deal when it came out in early February, but just the next day, the SEC staff put out guidance with respect to shareholder proposals that also made a really big splash. So again, mid-proxy season, many companies had already submitted their no action requests to the SEC, and the staff put out guidance saying, we're rescinding prior guidance from the last administration. We're reinstating older guidance, and so now the results that we've been getting back from the SEC have certainly changed, and I think to the benefit of companies. The reversion to prior interpretations of the rules have definitely resulted in more proposals from shareholders being deemed excludable from the proxy statement. So, I think that's been great, but I think we also have to think ahead. Well, how are shareholder proponents likely to respond to this if they feel that they're not able to communicate their views through the 14A8 process? Are they going to look for other ways to do it? And what we're hearing, we're not sure if it's true yet, like we'll see over time, but we are starting to hear some murmurs that shareholder proponents will look to other means, including using Rule 14A4 as a means to get proposals in front of shareholders. This is a rule that doesn't have the same limitations as Rule 14A8. But it does have its own limitations in that if a shareholder wants to present a proposal this way, they have to solicit other shareholders, they have to disseminate proxy materials. And so for many, it won't be worth the expense and the effort, but there are certainly proponents for which I think it will be, and they might take that path. So, we are trying to think creatively and actively working on ways to respond if that becomes a trend, and including we're looking at bylaws, and are there ways to use the bylaws and make amendments there that can help address this scenario. So yeah, if anyone's interested in talking more about that, please do reach out to me and Sean.
Yeah, and I'll just add sort of other topics that I think the board should think about for its agenda. I would just say keep an eye on Texas. There's been a lot of debate recently about Delaware and companies leaving Delaware. Of course, Delaware has been the domicile for the vast majority of U.S. public companies for several decades. But four developments that I would just keep in mind, and we're very much in the early innings of this. So number one, just a week ago, the Delaware legislature and governor, adopted a significant revision to the corporate statute that addresses, among other things, sort of the outcome of the Elon Musk compensation case at Tesla, and other sort of matters relating to controlling shareholders and books and records demands that relate to sort of pre-litigation. So issues that I think most people would say are pro-company amendments. And this was all done sort of in the face of a number of very high profile companies, deciding or announcing that they may leave Delaware. So that just happened last week. Another thing that just happened last week was while, the companies that have announced they were leaving previously, or sort of like Tesla and SpaceX, Dropbox, these were all controlled companies. So, you need a shareholder vote to leave the state. Those were all controlled companies. They could dictate that outcome. We actually saw the first non-controlled company, sort of a regular way, widely held company, in this time frame, put out a proxy seeking to move out of Delaware. That was Simon Property Group, seeking to move from Delaware to its home headquarters state of Indiana. And it'll be very interesting to watch on a number of fronts. One, will ISS support this? Will Glass Lewis support this? Will the large institutional investors support this? If they do, if they pass that vote, I'm not saying it's opening, like the gates for people, hundreds and hundreds of companies moving, but it will lay the groundwork, I think, for a number of companies to think very seriously about moving. So then, okay, so where would they move? So I think, Indiana was a specific case for Simon, because that's where they're from. I think the two states that are getting the most attention are Nevada and Texas. But the reason I started by saying keep an eye on Texas are two other developments. So one, as you may know, Texas in September launched a brand new specialized business court, the Texas Business Courts. And actually just last month, they issued their first opinion on the merits on a case. So, they're making real progress. And I think part of the promise of the courts was, swift decision-making by professional court who understands corporate issues. And I think, it's super early days, but I think everyone involved in what we've seen so far is that is a promising early start to that, the new regime in Texas. And secondly, it's not just Delaware, it's Texas and its legislature are also actively looking at amendments to the corporate statute. So there's right now a suite of amendments that are under consideration in Texas that, I think are intended to attract more public companies to move into Texas or to go public in Texas. And they include things like, incorporating, codifying the business judgment rule of Delaware into the Texas statute, making it much harder for directors to face liability. And I think one pretty interesting one, making it allowing companies to impose a minimum threshold for derivative litigation, which just means, in order for a shareholder to file a derivative complaint, they'd actually have to hold, 1%, 2%, or 3% of the company's stock, and in essence, have real material skin in the game before they bring a derivative complaint, which is something that I think would be very attractive to a number of companies thinking about it. So, as I said, early days, but I think something that ought to be on the agenda. That's what I got.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure others will as well. We at the Rock Center really appreciate your participation and look forward to speaking with you all again in the future. So thank you both, Sean and Christina.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks, Jackie.